It's a blustery, rainy day here in Minnesota, and we've needed it for some time, so it's quite pleasant to wait.
Well, congratulations. That's wonderful.
Yes, thank the good Lord. Thank the good Lord. So here we are today to talk about, we are very close to the end today.
Getting closer.
Indeed. Looks like you're in new digs.
Not from last time. I've just decided to set my computer up on a box of books instead of having it set down on the desk. So
I see. Okay.
Better angle. But,
all right.
Yeah, we're still in the new apartment in Orvieto. I suppose the old apartment in Orvieto. But here we are. Although I'm sure the building, at least the foundation of the building of this house, probably predates the previous one by a few centuries. The other being from the 16th century. This one, I gather, has a little bit earlier provenance. But
Europe,
you know,
where I'm watching
in the new digs.
Yeah, I'm watching buildings being put up, across the way, and there's the new stuff, all this prefab stuff, and new there is like, it's 1600s, not the 1400s.
Yeah, right.
Funny. Well, can we talk today about The Hobbit? We have a short chapter today. These last two chapters are rather short.
Yeah.
But fit in there to talk about, I think, yes?
Yeah, and it's a really interesting chapter to talk about. And they're two really different chapters, right? Two very different chapters, both going home. Chapters about going home for different characters, I suppose to say, but in very different ways. Very different ways.
Yeah. How are they similar?
Recap.
I'm sorry?
I was going to say, why don't you give us a little recap of the chapter? What goes on here? What's the key thing for those few of our viewers who haven't read all the way through yet?
If you haven't read the books or seen the movie or ever heard of The Hobbit, here we go. Basically, they've just come out of the Battle of Five Armies. Bilbo's gotten knocked on the head. He wakes up and he is rescued by a man who takes him back to the camp where he sees Thorin. And Thorin is on his deathbed, and he is able to apologize and reconcile with Bilbo. And then Bilbo packs up his things after the death of Thorin. He packs up his things, and he goes back home. That's basically a synopsis of it. There's a little bit that describes what happens in the battle after Bilbo gets conked on the head. And we get a little bit of information about what happens afterwards with Dane and his people. But that's pretty much what happens in terms of the movement of the plot.
Yeah. And then it's just the one more chapter to the end. The next chapter being the one where Bilbo makes his way home.
There's always a neat thing when you're reading a novel or a work, when you get to the last 2 or 3 chapters, and you're like, I made it, and here I am finally at the end. It's also the story, is winding down, of course, but you do get that sense that, wow, I've come this far. I know that there's some books where the last 3 or 4 chapters read like wildfire. You just eat them up. Mm-hmm. Can't believe how fast they actually go. Lord of the Rings is that way for me, certainly. Anna Karenina. You just like you can't wait to get to the end, not because I can't stand this novel, but because the action is just so intense. Yeah. So
here, I thought it was interesting, this one, that you've got, this chapter and then the final chapter, some repetition that occurs to me, and it's not repetition in equal sense, but something happens in a minor way, and then it's repeated again in its major way in the final chapter. And that's, the key thing that stands out to me was Bilbo's got knocked on the head and he remembers no more, right? That's why he essentially misses most of the battle, as this is what's happened. And in this one, they've sent, in the beginning, this chapter opens up with Bilbo sort of coming to, essentially, after being hit on the head with a rock during the battle, during the early stage of the battle. He's been knocked out senseless. He's been invisible because he's had the ring on. And thus, they have people looking for him. This is kind of the last time, we're told that this is the last time somebody's going out to look for the Hobbit, because he's been missing, right? And in some ways, it was they're beginning to presume that he is dead. And it's not too much of a spoiler to give away next chapter when he gets back to his little hole in Hobbiton, because he's been gone for so long. He's essentially being presumed dead by the townspeople, and they're auctioning off his things. So there's this double coming back from the dead on the part of Bilbo here, which I think shows us two layers of that. After we read the final chapter, I think we can go back and we can understand something more about this chapter, and that's why I think it's worth having that in mind ahead of time as we look at it. He's not merely coming to from being unconscious, but there's an element of coming back from being presumed dead, or something like a death-like state.
Yeah, no, that's jumping into it with both feet right there. The opening of the...
I didn't mean for that to get so deep right away.
No,
but just kind of came.
Yeah, let's just go for the throat. No, the opening of it has always struck me because he wakes up on Ravenhill, first off.
Yeah.
And the man that comes to get him, I mean, first off, he's a nameless man. Who is this guy? We don't even know who he is, but he's never named. It's just some fellow combing the hills for Bilbo. And he hears a voice and he thinks it's a ghost, because he's invisible.
Right.
Bilbo wakes up and he says he's cold all over, like he's been out and exposed to the elements, and so he's cold all over like a corpse. So there are all these indications of his being like a dead guy at the opening of this chapter. So absolutely, yeah, this chapter is like a born again sort of thing. And I can't help but think, on the one hand, there's that immediate response that a person has. Any of us who have been through physical trials, doesn't have to be near-death experiences, just going out for a run or a walk or whatever, and you're like, whew, at the end of it, and there's a sense of just invigoration that you've come back to being in health again. When you've been sick for a while and you come back to health again. And I think that there's that immediate response that Bilbo has come back from a state of being dead, and now he's invigorated. He's back with the living. But I think there's also something here that the end of the book, we've talked about it as a psychological story, and a story of struggling with one's inner demons, so to speak. And here he is in a cataclysmic battle at the end, which is, I think we brought it up last time, it's a bit of a cosmogony, creation of a new world sort of thing, with all these different elements thrown in, eagles and bears and fire and water. And I think at the end of it, when he gets knocked out, he does transform himself. There's a Ragnarok, if you will. And he is at the end. He's the man, the woman that are born again at the end of Ragnarok to come back to himself. So I think that Tolkien's saying something rather profound on a psychological level here, too. We don't just have nice answers and then wake up and everything's fine. Psychotherapy doesn't just... stroke your ego and send you off to play with the kids again.
Right.
There's some serious trauma that one goes through. There's some serious soul searching that one goes through. There's serious experiences that people go through. It does alter you permanently. So here's a different Bilbo, different guy on the other side of this whole experience. Absolutely.
It is, and he thinks about things differently now too. I mean, the first things that he notices about the aftermath of the battle that he comes to and he sees, and he kind of deduces that it was a victory, I suppose by the fact there's not goblins running around everywhere. But there seems to be more men and elves than others, but there's carnage everywhere, and everybody seems very somber. Like it's a victory, but it's a victory not without pain, not without loss.
Yeah. Yes.
And he comes... Go ahead.
There's one good line from Star Wars that I can quote here, where Luke goes to find Yoda in the second Star Wars movie, which fifth Star Wars movie, for those of you who care, it's the second Star Wars. And he says, I'm looking for a great warrior. And Yoda says, wars do not make one great. That's a great line there. A really good line. Right. Wars do not make one great. And there's that sense here, too. This is a war, and we've won, but it's not something we're going to be jumping up and down about and shooting our guns in the air. This is a lot of people died. And there's a lot of blood that was shed for Bilbo's salvation, so to speak. You know,
Yeah.
not just to, well, okay, not just to save Bilbo, but also to rid the land of this tremendous evil, because Smaug dies with the arrow in his breast, which is the way it should be. But the goblins then are like a reiteration of Smaug. They even come down from the, they come down in swarms. They want to burn and loot and pillage. So they're kind of like a second dragon in a way.
Right, and they become a manifestation then of the inner darkness that has consumed Thorin by that point.
Yes, yes.
And in their being purged also is, and we learn in the course of this chapter, Bilbo is told what happened, what has happened while he's been out, while you were sleeping. Here's what went on. We have in many ways the purification, redemption of Thorin. He bursts out, of course. Finally, something clicks and he comes to come around. A very dramatic, I suppose you could say, something of a conversion. He charges into the battle. Of course, he's slain along with some of the other dwarves as well, who have become very dear to us. But in that way, you're right. There's this, in some ways, the destruction of the secondary dragon or secondary dragons that have taken the space. But it seems to be really in that, even in Thorin's own death, at this point, a noble death, because he died coming out fighting on the right side rather than staying holed up, or even worse, fighting other good guys, right? He dies a noble death rather than what could have been a very criminal death. But in his death and the destruction of all the goblins, in some ways it's as though the mountain itself is redeemed in this really old biblical sense of the term, that somehow it needs to be purged of the impurity that has laid upon it. But by the dragon being there, it's not merely enough that the dragon should be slain, as we've seen, because the dwarves and Bilbo are among the gold. They get poisoned by it, right? Thorin gets poisoned by this. The land is still impure, it's still unclean. And the fact that the goblins can come with such impunity pouring over the mountain shows that the mountain itself is in fact covered by goblinness, by uncleanness, by this darkness of Morgoth. And only through this battle, through this Ragnarok kind of cataclysm, is the mountain itself then made habitable for Dain and his kinsfolk, because it's been purified, it's been cleansed, it's been made, it's just all those things, right? It's been made habitable, it's been made clean, and thereby able to be entered and rebuilt.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, because on the one hand, you've got that image of Thorin, who has been corrupted by the gold, and he speaks a couple times about the infection of the dragon horde. I think it's in the next chapter, and we'll get to it. We find out what happens to the master, for instance. And he doesn't do well with sudden winning the lottery,
right?
But it does infect Thorin particularly too, and so there's something that's necessary for him in order to be freed of that. And I want to get to the death of Thorin in a minute, but then the idea of purging the mountain, absolutely. It's like, this is what's necessary in order to rid that area of the world of that dragonishness. And therefore, this is necessary in order to rid a human being of this dragonishness, to go through this kind of purgation, this calamity of experience. There's a neat line, I was looking the other night, there's a neat line in the Rankin Bass version of The Hobbit, which, has some merit to it and has some flaws, certainly. But the scene of Thorin, they add some words that are not Tolkienish, they're not Tolkien words. And there the Thorin says, and does it take this for us to realize what is really important? He says to Bilbo as he's dying. And that's a very blunt sort of line to Americans, especially, this, wake up, Americans, this is what's happening in this scene. But still, it's a decent line, because I think it does kind of embody what we're talking about. This is what's necessary sometimes for somebody to wake up to what's really real, what's really important. You know, we often have a problem, I think, with characters dying in a story, and we think, oh, it's awful that they died. But in some ways, maybe they had to die in order that something happened, or in order that they realized something. My students always said, Lancelot dying at the end of the story. It's like, that's it, he dies, you know?
What?
Well, yeah, but he, you know, that he had to. He had to come to the point. You know?
His story is over there.
Yeah,
he kept screwing it up otherwise. I mean, it's beautiful. That's one of the most moving one of the most moving death scenes to me in literature is actually two of them are both from that same. I'm talking Mallory's work here, but of the death of Lancelot and the death of Arthur are just and the lead up to the death of Lancelot and Arthur are just absolutely.
And the only any better, I think, than Mallory is actually Howard Pyle in the late 19th century, early 20th century, where he writes 4 volumes series on Arthur, and there he has a death of Elaine scene, which is also very traumatic. But that is an extremely moving scene, but it's what was necessary for Lancelot in order to come to the realization of what was really important. It's also interesting in Mallory, I was researching this the other day, Lancelot never smiles or laughs with joy throughout the entire work. Only at the end does he die with a smile on his face, which is pretty for that
even
scene.
though he's Captain the Joyous Guard.
Yeah, right. Yes. So back to this work, you know, we have here what's necessary for Thorin, what's necessary for Bilbo, as well as what's necessary for the land, is this very thing. A war which unites people, but also rids the world of a really bad scourge, really terrible scourge. You brought up the image, though, of nobility, if I can dwell on that for a minute.
Yeah.
This book, in general, has so much of the noble in it.
Yeah.
It's one of the things I love about Tolkien is that his work, on the one hand, there's a realism to it, certainly, a modern realism to it. And there is a poetic nature to it, and a dramatic nature, but there's also a noble nature to all his writing. People, as Thucydides said, if they did not say this exact thing, they should have. You know?
Right.
And I remember scene after scene, I think this is one of the things that really has stirred fans since these books first came out. You have scene after scene in this book and in Lord of the Rings where characters say things or do things. They think, gosh, I wish I had thought of that when I had a similar experience. Yeah. Not that you have to confront the Nazgul Lord coming into Minas Tirith necessarily.
But when you do, you'll know how to handle it.
You just don't see that that's what you're doing, you know what I mean? And wouldn't it be great if you had a script writer that could tell you what to say? Because that scene where Gandalf stands up to the Nazgul Lord and says, "You're not coming in," basically, beat it, is tremendously moving. Or at the bridge of Khazad-dûm, or where Sam defies Ungoliant.
Right.
I'm sorry, Shelob, not Ungoliant. Shelob.
Yeah.
Those scenes are just amazing scenes, and I don't think if you're doing like a realistic work, you wouldn't have somebody have the perspicacity, the wherewithal, to be able to utter words like what are uttered in certain scenes, because people get flummoxed, as the Bilbo says. And you don't always know what exactly to say, but that capturing of that imagery, that capturing that nobility, is remarkable in Tolkien's works. Scene after scene of this is how it should be. And that death of Thorin, particularly for me, that death of Thorin is particularly noble. He dies in a way which, as you said, is a noble way of dying. He's fighting for the right. He's fighting against overwhelming odds and tremendously dark forces. And yet he falls, as it says here, he falls at the spears of many enemies. Let's see if I can find the passage really quick here. This is when Thorin enters the battle and Beorn comes in. And we'll get to Beorn in a minute, but it says, Beorn stooped and lifted Thorin, who had fallen, pierced with spears, and bore him out of the fray. Now that alone right there is a great line, because it doesn't say like his guts were hanging out or he died choking on his own blood or, anything like that. It's nothing like this tremendously gory scene, which Tolkien would have seen that. That's what's striking to me. That's what he would have seen on the battlefield of World War I.
Yeah.
Instead, Beorn is pierced with spears. Okay, we got it. Move on, And he bore him out of the fray. And then further on, it says, with the death of Thorin, let's see, where Keely and Feely die, right? And where was that? That was, here it is. This is where they're talking about the tomb of Thorin. Upon his tomb, the Elven king then laid Orcrist, the elvish sword that had been taken from Thorin in captivity. It is said in songs that gleamed ever in the dark if foes approached, and the fortress of the Dwarves could not be taken by surprise. There now, Dane, son of Nain, took up his abode, and he became king under the mountain, and in time other dwarves gathered to his throne in the ancient halls. Of the 12 companions of Thorin, 10 remained. Feely and Keely had fallen, defending him with shield and body, for he was their mother's elder brother. And I like that imagery of not just the fact that he's laid in state, but that Feely and Keely also fall in battle, defending him with shield and body. The very phraseology is nobility, for he was their mother's elder. And I've done this before, and I've tried to shy away in the last few episodes from doing it, but I got to make the comparison. The modern penchant now is to do everything for a romantic reason, to defend a gal, a hot chick. And in the movie version that Jackson put together, I think it's Keely, dies defending a hot chick, hot elf chick.
Oh, that was the stupidest end. The whole subplot there.
It was bad. It was bad. And not only was it bad, but then she dies, immediately. I have to say, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen the movie, she dies. Yeah. But
you gotta get rid of her because she doesn't fit in the story, really.
Yeah, right. She doesn't fit. She doesn't come up anywhere else. So you got to get rid of this fake character that she made. But it changes the nature of Feely and Keely's death.
Right.
It changes the nobility of the death. And I can't quite put my finger on it. It's not that it's less noble to die defending a woman or female elf than it is defending your king, a liege lord. Not necessarily.
But it's a different kind of act insofar as the way, I think the difference lies in the way that it's received by the viewer or the reader in this case. You see, especially the nature of that quasi-romantic relationship that they built in the film. And I've only seen large parts of it, not in its entirety, but it's a cheap relationship. It's not deep. It's like any good movie, any typical sort of blockbuster movie romance. They've known each other for a matter of hours or days. Like Romeo and Juliet have a deeper relationship than the two of you guys. This is all that goes with that, but that there's a deep level of self-interest in that.
Yes.
And predictability. It doesn't go to the how does Hopkins put it? Something, hidden deep down things, right? It doesn't go down deep into the deepest parts of someone dying for their liege lord, in this case for their kinsman, defending him with shield and body, not only because he was their lord, but also because he was their mother's other brother. He's flesh and blood, so they died defending him with their flesh and blood. Yeah. And we're shown how a good died, a good death for a king was shown shortly in his replacement, how a good king should rule. And here we're shown with Feely and Keely how good thanes should die beside their lord, how should relate to their lord in that way. And there's a different lesson being taught. Like, it's supposed to be a lesson about loyalty, about fraternity, about family and king, which is to say more of the same thing, different than a death for the sake of romantic desire, which is not, that's a thing that's valuable in itself, but it's a different kind of act. It's a different kind of example to be given there.
I think you touched on it there with the idea of self-interestedness too, because and I want to put this delicately, the selfish nature of romance, especially sexual elements of romance, is not to be discarded. And when you die for your king, you die in a very disinterested way. I mean, yes, you're interested in getting rings and land and honor when you survive it. So it's like risking something. But you're dying for somebody who you aren't going to get. There would be no immediate gratification if you died for the guy, so to speak. It's like, why necessarily would you want to trade your life for this guy's life? And the trading of your own for somebody else's life it resembles the whole salvific nature of the cross, the Christian thing. Whereas in a romance, especially one with a beautiful, because that actress is beautiful, she's a beautiful young lady. The death for a beautiful young girl, there is a really big self-interested element there, because if you survived it, you'd have the girl, you'd have the hot babe, you'd have the hot elf chick, and who doesn't want a hot elf chick, right? So there's that, certainly. And I think that ultimately it speaks to a difference in how we conceive of love overall. And I think Tolkien's vision of love is tremendously larger than Jackson's. He has a much more expansive vision of what love actually looks like. Because when we realize what we will die for, we also realize at the same time what we will live for, right?
Right.
And that allows us then to understand where our loves are placed as well. So when we are willing to die for our king, we realize that we are placing our loves in a much more expansive selflessness than if we are willing to die for the hot elf chick. That makes a much more selfish form of love. And Aristotle would certainly say it's a lesser form of love, because the physical love, the physical desire, is a lesser form of love. Not just because it's self-interested, because it's also paltry and it's ephemeral, it changes, and the object of love is not as important in that instance.
Right. And I want to be clear, because we're speaking to people, anybody seeing this, or this conversation, it's part of this conversation in, say, a more passive way, is living within the modern West, where they may have certain preconceptions about things. This isn't because, for some way, this has nothing to do with sex, instead of being man or woman. This is because she's a woman, or even somehow that would be less. Because Aristotle gets pinned with a lot of this stuff too, and I think is a misreading in large part in some bad translations. But the modern Western mindset, it's not lesser because it's death for man instead of death for woman, or anything like that, or because Fili and Kili are men to the men, it's somehow better, it should be women for women. Any of that kind of stuff, none of that even enters into the conversation, not even as a side thought. It's about the nature of the relationship, whether they're men or women. So if Thorin was the queen instead of their king, this would still be valid. If the person who died was a woman instead of a man, that would still be valid, right? And we see this in so much of other literature, the different not iterations, different permutations and combinations of how this can work. But just to put that caveat out there, this is not caveat, but this disclaimer, this isn't about man or woman, but about the nature of the relationship and the orientation and motivation that you have towards sort of a natural biological relationship, with a promise thereof towards procreation, and something of the dying for your Lord, dying for the common good.
Yeah. And I agree.
Because that is to say, dying for your people, the good of your people.
Yes.
Right, because that's the Lord embodies then the whole. He's the prince. He or she is the principle of unity of the whole nation, of your tribe or nation, right, whatever it is.
Now, and I agree with the. You said caveat. The caveat. The disclaimer. I agree with the disclaimer. I do quote from the author of Lord of the Flies, right?
Yeah.
And he said the reason that he didn't put girls on the island is because sex would raise its lovely head at that point, and you have to address it. And I think he's old school, of course, but he's touching on something which I think is very important and maybe something we've lost or ignored in our modern era, which is that between man and woman, there is always going to be some element of that sexual nature, and almost unavoidable. The relationship between man and woman is different from the relationship between man and man, which is a very radical statement to make these days, I know, but that's why even if one has a queen, it is a different image than if one has a king. You know, and if you die for your queen, it's a different thing than if you die for your king. And this really is fascinating to me because something happened in Europe sometime around the 1000s, 1100s that is unique to Western culture, and that is realizing that there was this difference in relationships between men and men and men and women, or women and women and women and men. Europe subordinated the sexual desire to almost a platonic ideal in the form of the cult of Mary and in the form of chivalry, the chivalric subordination of the knight to his woman. Something which I've tried to explain to numerous colleagues and students over the years. Knights do what they do in chivalric works, the Arthurian stories, the Vulgate cycle, and like. They do them to some degree in order to have sexual conquest, but they more than often they do them without any kind of promise or any kind of resolve for that tension at all. In fact, they end up creating an image of beauty and goodness and nobility which transcends the mortal flesh of the woman that they admire. That, you know, and you see this in spades later on with Cervantes in Don Quixote, where he takes Dulcinea del Toboso, who's a prostitute, and he never sees her during the entirety of the novel, but he makes her into this ideal woman, and then he goes about daring do for it. You know, that whole phenomenon that happened sometime around the 1000s, and primarily happened in France and in England, is really unique. I don't know of anything else in other cultures that is like that. And you see it also in things like Beowulf even. In Beowulf, you have the women in Beowulf end up being almost idealized characters. When you have the image of Wealhtheow, for instance, she is shown as a perfect wife. She goes, what does she do? Well, she speaks kindly, and she goes around filling everybody's wine cup. Well, that's, I mean, you know, the modern criticism is that's not a woman. Women do more than that. I can't help but think the people that read Beowulf are like, yeah, we know women do more than that. They knew what women were. I mean, hell, you can think that some of the Vikings probably went on their raiding parties to get away from their women, you know? Because they've been up for 4 months in the freezing cold with the women and children. They're like, let's go raid something. All right, Ulf, let's go, you know? Yeah. So they were very well aware of what women were. So why didn't they put it into their literature? I think it's because they were saying something about the nature of the idealized form of women. And so, yes, Wealhtheow in Beowulf is an ideal. You don't see her berating Hrothgar for letting the whole place go to crap for 8 years, whatever it is. You know, you don't see her going around demanding things. You know, she doesn't do that. You also have a contrast in Beowulf, too, with another woman who is not that way. She's not gracious. And she's miserable because of it. Right. My point being is that when you get rid of that ideal of woman by getting rid of chivalry and getting rid of the idea of nobility in men, I think you end up doing a disservice to Western culture, certainly, and you end up doing a disservice to works like Tolkien, who really was himself steeped in this image of the ideal feminine. And one last point on this. There's a line in here which we didn't emphasize, but I think is really, I'm kind of startled by certain lines that come out in Tolkien. It says, Fili and Kili had fallen defending Thorin with shield and body, for he was their mother's elder brother. You know, that seems like a throwaway line, right? But it's almost like they're saying the very reason they defend him is not because he's king. It's because he is the brother of the mother that they honor. Okay? And if that's the case, then why are they fighting? They're really fighting for their mother. To me, that's very moving. I find that very moving. It sounds like a throwaway line, but it's almost like what is the two sons that is it in Roman mythology where they go off because the mother urges them to, and they pull a cart or something like that. You have images of these sons doing things for mother, and men on the battlefield. World War I, World War II, they cried out for mother. They longed for mother. Just before the battle, mother, I was thinking just of you when I saw the rebels coming. That's a Civil War song.
Yeah.
Boys and men in battle frequently are like, mother is the image that they go back to.
Yeah.
That is, on a psychological level, that's really startling to me. Is it true that every man marries his mother? In that sense, they and look for women that are their mothers. I don't know.
I don't know about that. I think, but it's an interesting thing too, because we're so much bound up with that. At a basically sort of material psychoneurological level, somebody would say, well, you find yourself infantile in the face of impending death, right? The enemy hordes charging at you.
Yeah.
You think about mom and you wet yourself. Like, those are the two main, two principal things that happen. Like, so you're reduced to this state. And that I don't know, maybe that's sufficient, but there may be something more to it.
Well, there is on the one hand,
which is
the appeal that occurred in World War I to do this for mother. Mother urges you to do this. Your mother sends you, and I don't think it's. I think there's an element of the infantile, certainly, because when we're scared, what do we want? We want to be.
You want mommy and cry out in the dark. Want to be held.
Protect us, draw us to her bosom. But even Christ uses this image at one point. He says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, would that I could gather you to my breast as a mother hen gathers her chicks." The image of
compares himself to a mother hen.
Yeah, right. The image of nurturing, the image of protection. I think in certainly Western culture, and I can't speak for Eastern culture or other cultures, but in Western culture, the image of mother developed into something which was not just the ideal. It was almost like it was the core of civilization. It became, mother became the character that allowed hearth and home to hold together. Even Hestia in Greek mythology, she was the garter of the flame of the home, and the Vestal Virgins.
Right.
So here it's almost like they're the cause of why we do what we do. Why do we defend things that are good and noble? Why do we defend things that are beautiful?
Because it's the source, it's the womb, it's the home, it's the hearth, it's the it's everything that is good and wholesome. Yeah. And it's that which brought you forth, brings you forth into the world, and that which receives you when you're like the earth itself. Like the tomb is like a womb that receives you back in. And I think all of those images are connected in a deep way. So when you speak of the motherland as well, I think there's a lot.
And when we change, because we have changed the image of mother in our modern conception, even since the time of Tolkien in the 1950s and 60s. And I'm not one to harken back to the 50s as being a perfect era.
Goodness, no.
But Tolkien grew up in an era where there was a specific role for mother, and it was wholesome, and it was nurturing, and it was caring. And he grew up in a certain era that honored women in a certain way, and they knew when a man was not honoring women, and that guy got his teeth knocked in. And we've grown up in an era, to be honest, I don't really have an easy way to say this, where beautiful women have been replaced by hot babes. Okay, and where mothers have been reduced to MILFs. And our current era of vision of women, and we see it everywhere. I think correct me if I'm wrong, you see it even more prominently in Italy, the streets with pornography. You see pornography on the streets all the time. The images of Christmas, and you see images in literature and movies. Even I will say, the image of women wearing tight leather clothing in all the superhero movies.
Oh yeah, the superhero stuff is just ridiculous.
It's radical.
But I will say there's different attitudes towards nudity, different ways that nudity is treated or the body is seen in Europe versus the United States for certain, but even among the Anglophone, essentially between historically Protestant countries and historically Catholic countries, such as the Mediterranean, part due to climate, part due to different theological presuppositions about the flesh. That does account for a lot of variation there. But let's take the typical mythos of our day, modern Western society, the superhero films. I mean, even go back to the superhero comics, it's the tight spandex thing going on as far as the uniform, and
Yes.
that's the principal attire of the heroines, right? Something that's sexually provocative and revealing, versus, and it is actually provocative and revealing, something that is even, I mean, it's pornographic, right? There's
Yeah.
something different than sexual,
Yeah.
but produces a consumerist mindset. It's fed by and it feeds on the consumerist mindset, something we consumed and discarded. As opposed to the different kind of sexual orientation, like that term is now loaded. But I mean, like the different way, the different kinds of feelings that are aroused related to sex and the sex is in something like, and I'm thinking not Victorian, but medieval, because I think there's a lot of our reading of medieval stuff that's colored by Victorian lens. But the medieval things, or some of these great icons of the past, and that you have these, the veiled woman, and I don't mean veiled like over her face, but the sense of this gossamer covering of the fairy queen, something like that, or pictures of the Madonna and Child, and other heroines, be they Christian saints or pagan goddesses. It's a very different way of illustrating that. It sets up a very different ideal. So that's something that seems to me to be the case. We appear to have lost Mr. Lassiter here. He too was consumed by the machine, or by the nothing. But here we are. I find myself now alone, like Bilbo when he came to. It's interesting. Yeah, there he is. Is he back?
I'm terribly
Bilbo,
sorry.
it is well that I found you.
One of the drawbacks of doing it on the phone is that people actually call me occasionally, and when they do, it like interrupts the entire call on blam. So
Yeah.
let me put, this is a symbol so later on when I'm doing the cutting, I know this is where I cut.
Okay.
Go back a minute. You were saying something about the nature of heroes and the uniforms and the revealing nature and all that.
Yeah, first, you see, you look at the way that especially with women, but female beauty is depicted, or the female body is idealized in the mythological structures of modern Western society today, in the 21st century, and 20th century, frankly, the superheroes, superheroines, and that kind of stuff, and villains. This tight spandex, revealing of the flesh was really effectively pornographic depiction or idealization of that, compared to something you see in the early Renaissance or the medieval period of the ideal depiction of feminine beauty and of the female body in either in literature or in art, whether that's iconography, secular art, or even pagan statuary and that kind of thing, where you've got sort of the gossamer veil of the fairy queen, or you've got the Madonna and Child. Even Madonna and Child with bared breasts is shown and depicted in a very different way.
Yes.
As the idealization of feminine beauty, or even in the early Baroque period, something like what's his name? Very sexual is Saint Teresa in Ecstasy by Bernini,
Mm-hmm.
right? His statue is made to be an altarpiece of all things, and it's Saint Teresa, and none, but she's in the throes of, she's a flagrante delicto,
Yeah, right.
and there's an angel holding this this arrow, these are the cherub, like the Cupid kind of arrow to her heart, to draw on that kind of classical imagery there, that he depicted with that. But this is a very different mindset towards idealization, the ideal of feminine beauty, and the relationship that we should have towards it, the orientation that we should have towards it, than what you see in the modern superhero.
Yes. Yes. And on the one hand, I find it to be merciless because it's very difficult to maintain that kind of ripped body. I mean, I'm not Jason Momoa. Okay, I'm sorry, folks. This is not Jason Momoa.
Underneath this pullover, there's a whole different man.
You know, as I forget who the actor was. Somebody, it'll come to me in a minute. But I don't think Jason Momoa is Jason Momoa. I think that you know, to maintain that kind of level of physical appearance is very, very difficult, and it's merciless to anybody that falls short of that. There's no element for slight flabbiness. There's no element for mistakes or errors in the body at all. You have to be pristine. You have to be airbrushed, as a matter of fact. So there's no mercy.
There's two things that's interesting. That one is, if people understood and really appreciated the sheer intensity of asceticism that these actors and actresses undergo in preparation for a film in order to sculpt their figure to a certain way, whether that's to be ripped or whether that's to be starved for a war film or something like that, they really undergo intense physical training or deprivation to achieve that look, and that's temporary for them. You see them offset, months later, a year later. It's very different. The second thing that you indicated there is most of it nowadays isn't even attainable by natural means, but has to be augmented by the machine, by screen trick, by literally airbrushing, and all that sort of falls under that broader heading in terms of the post-production editing of the visual depiction, computer generated stuff to fix and improve to complete the picture.
Yeah, and I think that both the machine and the physical punishment that one has to go through in order to achieve that level of physical perfection, again, it depicts a mercilessness, or it betrays a mercilessness which the modern era seems to impose upon people, contrary, if I may say so, to the paragon of mercy that the church has always held up, which is the Virgin Mary. She is the mercy. Why? Because Mother loves you because you are who you are. Right. And I think this also brings up a question of what we mean when we talk about nobility. What is nobility in general? I think nobility there's a mercy to nobility, because it's not holding you to this standard that you have to punish yourself for, or that you have to be airbrushed by a computer for. It's holding you to a standard which any human is capable of. And it speaks of a higher, greater state to human existence than what we see in this otherwise merciless world. Gerard Butler, for instance, in the movie 300, who really went through a grueling exercise routine. After it was done, he immediately went back to drinking Guinness. He was so ticked off by this. He went and he drank Guinness afterwards, and you can see him in later films. He balloons out again, And I think, well, that's the real Gerard. That's the guy that I would like to sit and have a drink with. I don't think I'd like to have a drink with King Leonidas at all, And I wonder about this in this story that we're dealing with here, because this is the second point. When we have Keely and Feely dying for their mother's elder brother, have them dying for a noble idea and a glorious ideal, which runs through the whole story, the idea of nobility and glory. Yeah. Or something which I think other people can be inspired to emulate. They can be inspired to emulate it through their own building up to that, or to get to the point where you're ready for it. If you have Keely or Feely dying for the hot babe, well, they get the hot babe because they themselves are hot. They're Jason Momoa, right. They're Gerard Butler, pre-300, and that in some ways is merciless, because like I said, I'm not Jason Momoa. Who is capable of getting that hot babe by being Mr. Beachbody? Who's capable of that? Or who's capable of getting that gorgeous hunk by being Miss Universe? I think the pool is very, very small. But if you are capable of giving your life, or giving your attention, or giving your own will over to somebody who is worthy of that kind of sacrifice, the Virgin Mary, somebody else who's noble or honorable. Well, anybody's capable of that. It doesn't really matter whether you're the best looking person on the face of the planet. So there's a universality to this nobility that I think Tolkien brings up, which I think is empty from other productions, shall we say.
Other versions of the story. Yeah, and I think that's right. I mean, as you just talk about the theme of mercy, there's this a picture right in this chapter of what, dimensions of mercy, or aspects of mercy that we often don't think about. And that is the mercy that is shown by the all-pervasive providence that runs through Tolkien's works. The mercy that is shown by providence to Thorin in Bilbo waking up as he is called for, so that Bilbo is able to come to Thorin Oakenshield just before Thorin Oakenshield dies, so that he can be reconciled to Bilbo. And he's a very different dwarf.
Yes.
Then we have seen him not only recently when he was like a rabid wolf, but he's a very different dwarf than we've seen anywhere in this tale so far.
That's a good point,
too. He dies a noble death. He says, "Farewell, good thief," he said. I go now to the halls of waiting to sit beside my fathers until the world is renewed. Since I leave now all gold and silver and go where it is of little worth, I wish to part in friendship from you, and I would take back my words and deeds at the gate.
And let's pull that apart for just a minute. Let's take that little passage and pull that apart. Okay. You said he's different from what he was before. Gandalf had said before that he was not cutting a very noble figure as king under the mountain, when he was a rabid state. Here he is, and he's speaking words of real beauty, which again, the script writer, we all could have a similar script writer for our own deaths. That would be really cool. But he said, the first thing he says when he looked up as Bilbo came beside him, and he says, "Farewell, good thief." He doesn't say so long, or nice knowing you, or something like that.
The word choice is ridiculous.
And then good thief, that's an oxymoron. That right there, that's like a tall and short and fat and thin and blonde and brunette. How do you be a good thief? There's an oxymoron in there. But this is kind of fascinating to me. It speaks of the oxymoron that we see like in Plato, where he talks about the noble dogs, right? The guardians of the city are described as noble dogs because they do have to be noble, but they also have to be as vicious as dogs. And here it's recognizing this guy is good. He's a decent guy, but he also has all the qualities that are necessary to get the job done. Thief. Wow. Good thief. That's a great moniker that he gives to Bilbo.
It is, especially coming off of the chapter of Thief in the Night. I mean, it's not immediately off the chapter, but that was a previous chapter title. He's the thief in the night. He came, and so he stole Thorin's heart. Right? He stole away with the Arkenstone the heart of Thorin and gave it over so that Thorin might be redeemed.
And Thorin accuses him of that.
Yeah.
Back if you're a thief, I never should have brought you on. You're a rat.
Right, you miserable old little burglar, and he shakes him like a dog on a rabbit.
Yeah. And so here the change is really significant, like you pointed out. He's able to recognize that Bilbo's good. He's not an enemy, he's a good character, but he's also a thief. And so he's got both in a good thief, this oxymoron.
And but this isn't go ahead. I was gonna say, and this to put it so rhetorically, the obvious this is not the Thorin the important dwarf of many words. And all the great moments in the story so far when he has stopped and had a, Hamlet-style monologue that we're not even told most of because he just goes on and on and on. The author summarizes it.
Yeah. And it's also not him being glib or being angry or being authoritarian in any way. It's very I think the next line is particularly intriguing too because it indicates a faith that Thorin has recovered. Which is the belief of going back to his fathers. Now, it's a pagan faith, obviously, and it's, because it's Middle Earth, he's a dwarf. But it indicates that he's dying with a sense of faith, a sense that a vision that he's going to somewhere else. And he's not just going to, go back to worm food And he's until the world is renewed. That speaks something like what the Norse mythology had, that idea of being in Valhalla until Ragnarok, you know.
Right.
But the covered that vision has been because of Bilbo's sacrifice and the battle and his own experience. Like the line out of the Rankin Bass production, does it take this for us to realize what's important? Mm-hmm. And then, I like this, that he actually asks to take back his words and deeds at the gate. Right? I asked to take those back. I'm sorry I said words. That takes
I would take back my words.
Yeah, yeah. It takes a big man to be able to say, I'm sorry, or I made a mistake.
Yeah.
You know, a big dwarf in this case.
Right.
This is very magnanimous of him, that he actually does, right before he dies, he says, I for forgiveness. Not you. I mean, he could have said, you know, are you here to apologize? You know.
Or even say, I forgive you for having to do whatever. No, I beg your forgiveness.
I'm dying now. Are you going to give me back my Arkenstone? He doesn't do that. He actually asks Bilbo for his pardon here, and that I think that speaks again of a magnanimity that he did not have before at all. The two words for the audience the two words are magnanimity and pusillanimity. Okay, magnanimity is is magnanimous, big souled. Pusillanimous is soul the size of a pusilla, a hair follicle. Okay, so either you have a great soul or you have a soul that's this big. Okay, so here he could have been pusillanimous, but he ends up having a magnanimity that extends to not just to Bilbo but to everyone around him, because you get the sense that he's had audience with other people as well. So go on with that.
And we see that in that contrast in Bilbo too, because Bilbo's response matches farewell, king under the mountain. He said, this is a bitter adventure if it must end so, and not a mountain of gold can amend it. Yet I am glad that I have shared in your perils. That has been more than any Baggins deserves. Now that is a world of that is a different world than the Bilbo who is bobbing on the mat saying, oh, this is all very awkward. This is the most awkward Wednesday he's ever had. You know, goodness, you know, how is he going to have to provide for these dwarves who've shown up unexpectedly for a party? He'll do it. He knows his part, but he's a greengrocer, right? He's pusillanimous and nervous in his own way, and calculating. He doesn't like things out of order. And here is a very different. He's not Bilbo the Rabbit. There's something very different here.
He's also not Bilbo the Dragon, because that's I point out to my students that Bilbo is a dragon rabbit, which, by the way, that's a medieval convention. You see that in the illuminated manuscripts. Frequently, they go a combination of rabbit and dragon fused together into one creature. So that's not without precedent.
It's actually a thing, yeah.
But here he's
which is why it's so funny in the Monty Python and the Holy Grail bit. There's a whole etiology there that leads up to that. That's for those who are in the know, who have eyes to see. That's a rich literature there.
Yes, absolutely, very rich. So here you're right. He's not a rabbit, but he's also not a dragon. And then this is another thing which shows a real change in Bilbo as well, is that he recognizes that human life, well, dwarf life, but human life is more important than gold, which is a big thing to recognize. I would trade your life, Thorin, for a mountain of gold. You know, I would give back a mountain of gold if it would prevent you from dying. That's really important. Because, again, what could he have done? Is that, well, you know, I'm sad to see you go, but hey, more cha-ching for us. You know, because when you bring it up, if you do the math, Keely, Feely, and Thorin have all died. And yet, everybody's still contracted to 1/14 share. Well, their 14th just grew by 3, right? Because now they have, you know, not as many people dividing it. So Bilbo could have said, hey, nice, you know, more cheddar for myself. That could have been him. And certainly, and you see that contract, again, I don't want to give away too much, but the master of the town displays that. You know, somebody like Gollum would have displayed that. Bilbo doesn't. I don't want the gold anymore. That's secondary. That's not as important. So you mean tertiary or, you know, whatever. I would prefer to have you around. And right after that line, I'm glad I shared in your perils. That's a beautiful line. Right? What is friendship but sharing in other people's perils? It's eating
Right.
the compensatory amount of salt with another person.
Yes. Eating of salt with another. That, which I'm sorry, we can't get into the whole richness of that phrase and all the places that that's used, but
Right.
note it for footnote to future conversation at some point. There's a lot to be unpacked with that.
Why does he say that this is more than any Baggins deserves? Why not this is more than any Took deserves? Why is it the Baggins side of him, I wonder?
Yeah, it's the Baggins half of him, right?
That was something which, I don't know if you've been following this whole Lord of the Amazon Rings thing going on, you know, the Rings of Amazon that's developing. But one of the big, I mean, they make a huge amount of mistakes. And they
I live under a rock. I don't know anything about happened.
Okay, well, for those who do live under a rock or in Oviedo.
On a rock, rather, but yeah.
Amazon has acquired the rights to certain elements of Tolkien's works, and they've been developing this series called The Rings of Power, which tells, allegedly, stories prior to the Second Age, mostly during the First and Second Age, so prior to the Third Age. And they have taken a great many liberties with the story, and they have cast a multicultural cast, and they have expanded on stories and convoluted historical gaps, and have characters doing things that they never did and other characters did do in the original lore. So to make a long story short, they've trampled all over the lore of J.R.R. Tolkien in making this miniseries for Amazon. And the fan base has come out in spades to just rake them over the coals. So among the numerous mistakes that they made, they talk about one character who is a Harfoot, and they say she's not a Hobbit because they can't actually say Hobbits. They didn't buy the right to be able to say the word Hobbit, so they say she's a Harfoot instead. And but they're Hobbits, right? But she has the wanderlust of the Bagginses. And as every fan has pointed out, that's not right. The Bagginses were not the Wanderlust group. It was the Tooks.
Right.
You know?
Tooks. Everybody knows this. It's right there.
It's a big difference. I'm sorry, but if Han shot first, come on.
It changes the whole plot.
It changes the whole plot, dang it. So I guess that's a long way of coming around to say, why does Tolkien make the point of saying this is more than any Baggins deserves? Is it simply because we're used to saying Bilbo Baggins, not Bilbo Took? Perhaps. But I wonder if it also isn't hearkening back to this idea that the Baggins was the sedentary. The Baggins was the guy who had all the wealth and sat at home and had luxury. And
even the word, he's a man, the Baggins name is rooted to Bag End. Yes. Even though it precedes Bag End chronologically, Bag End is named after him, not vice versa. Right. But Baggins, so great for everyone who isn't otherwise aware, Tolkien is a philologist and was really, I don't know, I think the conventional phraseology in modern American English, he was meticulously anal about word choice.
Yes, he was.
In everything. I mean, he wrote scathing comments to his editor about the use of the flower, the naming of the flowers that dangle from the windowsill at Bag End. They're nasturtiums, not nasturtiums. It's a different kind of thing. It's a botanical error, damn it. You know, I mean, so the choice of words is not something we can just treat glibly in Tolkien as we would elsewhere. But Baggins, he chooses this for a reason. You're absolutely right. And philologically, the idea of Baggins in English is something that, as I'm reading this in Italian translation and elsewhere, here in Italy, it's you lose a lot of the sense, and in some places they try and translate a name to catch the same sense in the native in the target language, but they don't do this with Baggins for obvious. So a bag, right, it just sits there, you know, kind of, it's just like a sack. It sits there frumpy, you know, on a chair. And the bag inside, we're being told repeatedly throughout the story, is like that. The bag inside, Bilbo would rather be sitting there frumpy by the fireside. And it's not the last time that he wished that. But the Took side, on the other hand, we know that the Tooks have, there's a rumor that there's fairy blood in their lineage somewhere, that is to say that they're part elf, perhaps. But that they go on adventures and they do great deeds every once in a while. They're more that way. But philologically, the name Took is also more pert, more terse, it's a monosyllable, and it's a sharp syllable. It's bright. It's, it has the connotations of it's a verb, but it's not a bag that just sits there floppy. But it's took, like he took off. He took up and went on an adventure, and so the names are important, and so that's why it's important that he says it's more than any Baggins deserves. That's chosen specifically because even the Baggins side of him is redeemed in this. One that wouldn't normally go on these adventures and was reticent. He's been reticent, through every step of the way, but has now changed.
Absolutely. And we've been talking about before how in the very beginning he is very self-satisfied. He has a sort of sanctimonious character.
That's right.
That he home, he had his pipe, he had his food, he had his treasures, and he has garden. And he can sit outside.
Bourgeois dragon sitting there.
Yeah. So much so that he never came down off the hill. I mean, we don't see it in this book as much, but we do see it in Lord of the Rings. Bilbo never really comes down off of his little mountain to see how the average hobbit lives. He never goes down to see whether Sandyman's mill is working or whether or not other hobbits are suffering or in need or whether or not the borders of the Shire are secure. I mean, Tolkien makes that very explicit in Lord of the Rings. He says that the Rangers have been protecting the Shire for years and the hobbits have no clue, they have no idea. And at the end of the work, certainly, you have the 4 hobbits come back and they have to scour the Shire after Sharky has come in and invaded and taken over, and wrecked things. So they're very aware of what really is at stake. But at this point here, Bilbo at the beginning really has no clue and doesn't want to have a clue. I mean, he even says at the beginning, we don't like adventures, And to find out that other people are in need or that there is other stuff to do in the world or that you have to come out of your mom's basement at some point, that's a bit of an right there.
Yeah. And we're told that Bilbo, this is all pre-adventure Bilbo, he's not really involved in the world of the workings of the Shire. We're told he likes to go on walks and wander about, rattle about the Shire. But there's never any mention of company. He's not with people. He's not mingling with other people. It's no different than the dragon who might go peruse about flying over the forest looking for something and come back to his lair.
Sure.
Now, Bilbo post-adventure is he's a very different person. And we're told, in Lord of the Rings, it looks back, and Bilbo, after his adventure, shares his gold generously, shares the treasure to provide good things for people. He really takes in Samwise. And tutors him, teaches him his letters as well, takes in Frodo, all these things. And he's become a different, he's more effusive of the good. He gives forth in that way. But he's also been named Elf Friend, which happens in this chapter, here we are, where we are, if I'm not mistaken, a little bit further on. And so he undergoes this transformation. But you're right, he was more dragonish, and this is not Bilbo the Dragon anymore.
No, this is now Bilbo who has been saved, as Thorin has been saved by the end of it. He has recognized that he is not worthy, not just of the gold, not just of the honors that have been bestowed on. He's not worthy of the suffering that he's gone through with with Thorin. And that's startling to me. It really is. It's like having a friend who's done great things, and why are you friends with me?
What have I?
Friends with somebody who's extremely artistic, or somebody who's a Navy SEAL, or something like that, and they've done monumental things, and you're like, what have I done that you would befriend me, oh Lord? There's a sense of humility, I think, that he has gained here at the end, in the sense of his own owing things to other people. So and again, nobly stated, but a very powerful sentiment that displays the change that has occurred in him over the course of this novel. And then we get, of course, this last bit, which is one of my favorite sections of the work, the Death of Thorin. You want to tackle that one there? Just read that.
Sure. So it's more than any Baggins deserves. No, said Thorin, there is more in you of good than you know, child of the kindly West. Some courage and some wisdom blended in measure. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. But sad or merry, I must leave it now. Farewell.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't actually see the death of Thorin, which I find startling, right? The next few lines.
Yeah, exactly. The author doesn't say, and then Thorin closed his eyes, and they came in. No, it's Bilbo turned away and went on by himself and sat alone wrapped in a blanket. And whether you believe it or not, he wept until his eyes were red and his voice was hoarse. He was a kindly little soul.
Yeah.
A mercy it is, he said to himself, that I woke up when I did. I wish Thorin were living, but I am glad that we parted in kindness. And this is that other dimension of mercy that we see, this real providence that he woke, a real mercifulness, something that is provided for him, that he and Thorin can part in friendship and kindness.
Yes. And I would hazard here, it's a mercy to us that we don't see the death of Thorin. Okay, because this is intriguing. Thorin doesn't die in the same way that Arthur doesn't die. I mean, Arthur actually passed on this earth. We don't see him like, and guts flying everywhere. And, we, again, not to bash too much on the modern world, but we've gotten so used to Hollywood deaths. People falling out of buildings like Klaus splits his nose in Die Hard, or people getting blown to bits and, or whatever. That we are almost immune to the real horror of death. It's like for us, the real horror of death is a certain, there's a sadness to it and a real tawdriness to it. It's not dramatic. And so it's almost like a mercy to not see it, to not show it. It preserves the nobility of a person. I mean, I remember, okay, I don't want to haul out too much here, but when my father died, right, there was an ignobility to it. And we had to endure that for almost 2 days before he died.
Yeah.
But it didn't strip him completely of his nobility. But had somebody not seen that, I think they would have preserved in their mind much more readily the nobility and honor and sort of dignity of my father in their mind.
Right. As if I may say, as many have.
Yeah, right. That's true with anybody who, when you see somebody die and you see them die nobly, it's like, okay, I can envision that nobility and keep that in my mind. Because you don't have to see all the other tawdry, ignoble, sorrowful things that accompany death.
The degradation of the body in its final hours and days,
Yeah, so here it's a mercy to not see it. I think this is one of the reasons why we still, so many strange things we still do in the modern world that's like, well, why don't you just stop doing that strange ritual? Because we've given all that up now, right? We still cover over bodies with a blanket after they're dead, at a death. Why do we do that? We're moderns, right? We can handle death, right? Why not just throw the bodies out in the street so everybody can see it? I'm being facetious, of course, but I think that when we don't see the death of Thorin, there's a nobility there, and a mercy to us that we don't see that. We do see the death.
We do,
right?
Yes, but
we don't see the death of Thorin.
And it's interesting that too that this is hearkening on a much of a much deeper, richer, greater tradition. There's a whole tradition of there's two things that broadly under the category of the king who will return again as a common theme in many, many cultures. And one of the variations of that is, of course, the king under the mountain. And so in many of the Alpine cultures, there's the history of the king, whether it's a dwarf king or a man king, who lies under the mountain. He will awaken when his people need him most, something like that, or he will come again. And of course, you see that same basic theme in the Arthur tales. Is he's Arthur, the king of Britain, the once and future king, right, who went off to Avalon, and he will come back at need to rule over his people in peace. Or Mallory hedges on both sides. It's beautiful how Mallory says, he went this way off to Avalon, out of this world. Maybe personally, or he was buried, but on his tombstone the inscription is Hic jacet Arcturus rex quondam rexque futurus, right? The king once and also the king to come. That there's this sense that there's an expectation and a hope looking forward. And so Tolkien is tying this into a more, what is for us, in our time, in our space-time continuum, is a more ancient tradition, but in Tolkien's world his sub-world that he's created, of course, remember, all of this in The Hobbit is supposed to predate our modern world.
Right.
All of this is ancient history of 10, 20,000 years ago. That's the when this is supposed to be meant to be situated in our own world.
Yes, and some things are constant no matter what age we live in. I wonder if it isn't true that expectation and hope are linked to mercy and nobility and a mysterious, you know.
I think it's very true.
Here you have a death scene without the actual death itself. And the words that are said, again, the script writer, we could all be so lucky, are powerful that he's able to say this to Bilbo, to remind him that there's more good in him than he knows. You know, you yourself may be down on yourself, but there's more to you than you recognize. And that you have courage and wisdom blended together. That's an interesting combination right there, courage and wisdom. Because courage is more audacious. You know, you do more things when you're courageous, but wisdom is like, no, wait, hold back. So you have, the blending of the two is important, almost like in an Odyssean way. Yeah. But he has that great line, if more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world, which is, I think, pretty darn accurate. And I will say, both versions of the movie both preserve that line. Now, where they place it, I think, is significantly different, because I think that the Rankin Bass one, for all of its flaws, places it right after the words of Tolkien. There is more of good in you than you know, child of the kindly West, some courage and some wisdom blended in measure, if more of us valued food and cheer. So they place it in the right place. In the Jackson version, he says, go back to your trees and your flowers and your shire, and enjoy your life, if more of us value food. So in other words, they cut out those other two lines about there's more in you than you know. I think it makes a big difference. Maybe it's because it's like there are sections of Tolkien which you just shouldn't meddle with the script. It's kind of like meddling with the Mass or something, or meddling with the Passion of Christ, And when you start monkeying with it, you change the very nature of the texture of what he was trying to get at. Thorin has the opportunity to say these brilliant words to Frodo, or to Bilbo, and then allows him then also to say a farewell and leave and preserve the nobility, the memory of Thorin as a noble character. Which, gosh, it's a great scene, a great image at the end here. Mercy, really.
It is a mercy.
Why do you think then Bilbo reproaches himself right after that? Because that's kind of an interesting little bit that he, you messed it up. You're a fool and you messed it up.
I think that feels very natural. If you've ever really wept until your eyes were red and your voice was hoarse after someone dear to you dies, the things that come to you in that process, the clear lucidity of some thought, some experience in a moment like that. Anyone, I think, who has had that kind of moment knows that there's some seemingly mundane thought that just comes very lucid, and there's a sense in which Bilbo is also, he sort of is moving, his emotions are moving from one to the other. He is spent. And so just in some ways, randomly comes the clear thought of, well, shit, for all that, there still was a battle. Because you remember, the night before, he snuck out, he did all this planning, he set this, and he took the Arkenstone, spirited it away, gave it. They had this beautiful, okay, he's doing this thing and it's all going to work out, and he does this noble deed. I'm going to be back with my friends, you understand, there. And the Elf King looks at him with a maven bard. They stare at him in wonder as he goes back, like, what the heck is this creature? Like, he's just not attached, He goes and he does this, he values fellowship, friendship above his own, saving his own skin, because we know that Thorin, we know dwarves are dwarves, man. It's not going to go well for him if they find out. And anyway, so all of this, all the planning, he goes to redeem Thorin, and well, shit, there's a battle anyway. and it was, many people die. You know, there's just the dead are many, we're told.
Yeah.
And there's a sense of like, well, you know, Bilbo, put your foot in it. I mean, so like in some ways, I think he's struggling with the feeling of, I mean, what else could I have done? Like that was the thing to do. That's what made sense. It was probably the only thing that could have accomplished anything, and I did it. But even that, right? The best laid schemes of mice and men oft gang a glee, right? Even the great and noble act of taking the Arkenstone in order to broker peace with it, to buy peace with the Arkenstone, this ancient gem, this magic heart of the mountain, this Silmaril, or at least somehow offspring of the Silmaril, it bears that lineage. Rescuing that and giving it to another to redeeming him, it places him up on the level of Beren, the one-handed, right? Even that is nothing but a wee bit heap of leaves and stibble that's going to get blown by the wind. Referencing the Robert Burns poem here, To a Mouse on the Turning Up of Her Nest in the November by Plough, for those who if you want to look the rest of the poem, but in the sense that that's where the phrase "the best laid plans of mice and men oft go astray," or whatever the English translation is for the Scots there. I think it's that feeling. I think it's a feeling of like, and we still had a war and everybody died.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
We do what we can, but things can still happen.
Well, you know, though, is that a recognition of our own mortality? In other words, is that a recognizing that we are not God?
We're not God, and in spite of all your efforts to buy peace and quiet, Bilbo, it happened anyway. But I suppose you can be hardly blamed for that. So it's not really a reproach.
No, not ultimately. Or it's a reproach.
It's a recognition of his...
He's able to talk himself out of reproaching himself, you know.
He's able to talk himself out of reproaching himself. It's a recognition of his smallness, of our ultimate impotence to control greater events.
Recognizing his smallness, right. Nothi se auton. Knowing what he was in the universe. He was not king of the hill. He is not.
You can't be blamed for that, but you can't stop a war.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, again, powerful stuff, because he is coming to the point now at the end where, as it says, he aches in his bones for the return journey. He's weary of the adventure part. He just wants to go back to be Mr. Baggins. And this is like Natus going back to his farm at the end, you know. And from an outside perspective, we're all like, wow, how noble and honorable and virtuous. And Cincinnatus is probably like, no, I'm just tired. I'm just, you know, don't want this. That recognition that we're not gods. Ultimately, even noble deeds that we do don't stave off what God wants, what God wills. It doesn't always work that we're able to orchestrate everything to our will. And this, wow, I just had a flash of insight. This very thing is brought up in Lord of the Rings, because what does Galadriel say when she's offered the ring, right? She's offered the, she says, oh, yeah, you know, this is a great idea. You give me the ring, I'll fix everything. Like, everything. You know? Okay, no, bad idea. She recognizes herself that if she were to become the god, it would be horrendous for everybody else.
Right.
And maybe whenever anybody has a pretense to think that they, by their own power, can fix the world, they end up becoming a dictator that nobody really wants.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's every dictator that the world has seen.
Yes.
Is not somebody, they're not most, I think, probably, I mean, being human beings, probably not driven by some primordial malice, at least in their conscious thought. They're trying to fix the world the way they feel it should be.
Yes.
It doesn't excuse them, but it helps us understand them. That that's what evil often looks like.
Yeah. It is more often somebody thinking that they are the god than it is somebody being just like, gonna rule the world. You know, it's like a culture reference, that image of Thanos, for instance. I'm gonna snap my fingers and fix the universe. Well, good luck with that, you know. You have 1/4 of the entire universe being snuffed out of existence, but you have a very good reason for it, Thanos. I understand you, man. And yeah, Bilbo here recognizes, I am essentially a little fool. I'm not king of the hill. I am not the dragon. I'm not the god.
Right.
So he's come at the end of the journey. He's come to a place, as it says at the beginning, he lost a great deal, but he lost his respect in the local area. But what did he gain? Well, I think this is one thing he gains. He gains the knowledge of his own humanity. He actually knows who he is. Compared to all the other, he goes back to those hobbits. We'll see most of them are still sanctimonious, even if they're not king of the hill.
Right.
You know, his self-knowledge, his ability to have seen these things and done these things and to have shared in the suffering of others, I think is a huge difference in his life. So,
yeah.
You know, on that vein, there's a lot more to talk about, but I think I'm going to suspend talking even about Beorn and the killing of Bolg and all that, and even the elf friend, because he becomes elf friend after he gives the necklace, right? He
gives part of the treasure to the elf.
Yeah, and then he's named elf friend, which is that's an important thing. But I think I'm just going to suspend it. I think, you know, there's a lot. The nice thing about being a teacher, and the nice thing about this series, is you don't have to know everything.
That's right.
You know, I think the thing that the students have to come to grapple with is that the teachers are humans who are discovering things too. And when you have a discussion on Hobbit, it doesn't have to be an exhaustive discussion. Some things, just leave it. And I think we are at that point. One last thing, though, Cameron, bring up is the very last bit in the chapter. You know, the very last 2 or 3 lines, because I love this. At the very end, they're standing there at the pass, right in the mountains. Which, by the way, I always thought the pass was like on the eastern side, but apparently it's you're going up, and then you're going to go down. And it's when they go up that they get captured by the goblins originally, before they go down. So it's about that before, but anyway, they're standing at the pass, and they're looking out back towards the east, and they see the lands there, and it says, there behind lay Mirkwood, blue in the distance and darkly green at the nearer edge, even in the spring. There far away was the lonely mountain on the edge of eyesight. On its highest peak, snow, yet unmelted, was gleaming pale. So comes snow after fire, and even dragons have their ending, said Bilbo, and he turned his back on his adventure. I think that's great. You know, and he says, I wish to be in my own armchair, but I think that's great. First off, there are so many lines in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit where fans especially will quote those lines because they're just choice lines. And this is one. So comes after fire, and even dragons have their ending. It's an echo of that thing that Frodo says, right? The darkness cannot prevail forever. Even dragons, even suffering, even horrendous things we have to go through have their ending. And that is also a mercy, I think.
Amen.
So for those who are watching, even podcasts and videos have their ending.
Their ending.
And this would be ours.
That's right.
My friend, thank you very much.
Thank you, friend.
Fair. To your Aries receive you at the journey's end.
And may the wind under your wings bear you to where the sun sails and the moon walks. Au revoir.
1, 2, 3, 4. Silver